The winter of 1878 came down hard on the Colorado frontier. Snow had been falling for 3 straight days, the kind that buried fences and turned the land into a silent white ocean. The wind pushed through the cottonwoods like a restless spirit, rattling every loose board on the lonely ranch at the edge of Dry Creek. Inside the small cabin, Elias Mercer sat beside a low-burning fire. The flames cracked softly while he sharpened a knife across a whetstone, slow and steady. It was a habit he kept when the nights grew too quiet. Quiet had been his companion for a long time. His cabin held little more than a wooden table, a narrow bed, a cast-iron stove, and a shelf with a few worn books he barely opened anymore. Once, long ago, the place had been louder. There had been laughter, a woman humming while she cooked, small boots running across the floor. But fever had taken both his wife and his little boy nearly 12 winters ago. Since then, Elias Mercer had lived mostly in silence. Outside, the wind groaned through the boards again. He paused his sharpening and glanced toward the door. Something felt different. For a moment, he thought he imagined it. Then it came again. A faint sound. Tap. So soft it could have been a branch against the wood. Elias stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. Another sound followed. Tap. Tap. Not a branch. Knocking. But it wasn't the firm knock of a grown man. It was weaker, unsteady. Elias set the knife down and reached for the lantern beside the door. The moment he opened it, the wind shoved snow inside the cabin. The world outside had turned white and gray, the night thick with swirling flakes. He stepped onto the porch and lifted the lantern. "Hello?" he called into the storm. The wind swallowed his voice. Then he saw something. A small shape curled against the porch railing. For a second, Elias thought it was a bundle of cloth blown there by the storm. But then it moved. He stepped closer. The lantern light revealed a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Her dress was thin and torn, her small shoes soaked through with snow. Strands of pale hair clung to her cheeks, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself as she shivered. Her face was pale, lips trembling. Elias knelt beside her quickly. "Easy now," he murmured. The girl tried to sit up, but her strength failed. Her small body collapsed sideways into the snow. Elias caught her before she hit the porch boards. She was freezing. He lifted her carefully. She weighed almost nothing. As he carried her toward the door, her eyes fluttered open. They were wide with fear. For a moment she looked like a cornered animal ready to fight or run. Elias kept his voice low and calm. "You're all right," he said gently. Inside the cabin, he shut the door against the storm and wrapped a blanket around her small shoulders. The girl trembled violently. Elias crouched in front of her so their eyes were level. Snowflakes melted on the brim of his hat and slid down the worn leather of his coat. "What's your name, little one?" he asked softly. The girl didn't answer. Her gaze darted toward the door, like she expected someone to burst through it. Elias followed her glance, then looked back at her. "No one's coming in here tonight," he said. Her lips quivered. For a moment she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Elias poured a little warm water from the kettle into a tin cup and held it out. "Drink slow," he said. Her hands shook so badly he had to steady the cup for her. She took a few tiny sips. Then suddenly her eyes filled with tears. Not loud crying, just silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen that kind of fear before. In soldiers, in wounded horses, in people who had been hurt too long. He gently placed his hands on her small shoulders. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "You're safe here." The girl looked up at him. For the first time she truly focused on his face. Her voice came out in a faint whisper. "They hurt me." The words barely reached the air. Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard many stories on the frontier, but something about the way she said it, so small, so broken, made his stomach twist. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin walls. The storm howled across the empty prairie. Inside, the fire cracked softly. Elias pulled the blanket tighter around her. "You're safe now," he said gently. The girl stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe those words. Then her strength gave out completely. Her head leaned forward against his chest, and she fainted. Elias held her there in the quiet cabin. His eyes drifted toward the snow-covered darkness outside the window. Someone had hurt this child, and if those people were still out there, the storm might not be the only thing coming for his cabin tonight. And for the first time in many years, Elias Mercer felt the old fire of a fight rising in his chest again. The girl slept for nearly 2 hours. Elias Mercer stayed seated in the chair beside the stove the entire time, watching the slow rise and fall of her small chest beneath the blanket. He had moved her to the narrow bed near the fire. The warmth had brought color back to her cheeks, though her brow still creased now and then, as if she were running through some dark memory even in sleep. Outside, the storm had begun to ease. The wind still whispered through the trees, but the heavy snow had slowed to a gentle fall. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he kept simmering on the stove. It was bitter and strong, just the way he preferred. His eyes drifted again toward the little girl. She looked even smaller lying there. Her dress was threadbare, patched in places by rough stitching that told of someone trying to keep clothing alive far longer than it should have been. But the marks on her arms, those troubled him most. Thin red scratches, one bruise along her wrist, and something else, a dark mark near her shoulder that looked suspiciously like the welt from a whip. Elias felt his jaw tighten. "Lord," he muttered quietly. The fire popped in the stove. For a moment he considered riding into town first thing in the morning to speak with Sheriff Rourke, but another thought followed quickly behind it. The girl's reaction when she had looked toward the door. That wasn't just fear. That was terror. And people who caused that kind of terror rarely stopped looking for what they had lost. The girl stirred softly. Elias set his cup down and leaned forward. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she looked confused, staring at the wooden ceiling above her. Then memory returned. Her small body stiffened instantly. She tried to sit up too quickly. "Easy," Elias said gently. She froze at the sound of his voice. Her eyes found him sitting by the stove. For a moment she simply stared. "Where?" she whispered. "You're in my cabin," Elias said. "Out by Dry Creek." Her breathing quickened. "They'll come," she said suddenly. The fear in her voice was sharp now. Elias kept his tone calm. "Who will come?" The girl hesitated. Her fingers gripped the blanket tightly. "The men," she whispered. Elias leaned forward slightly. "What men, sweetheart?" She swallowed. Her eyes filled again with tears. "The ones who hurt us." "Us." The word hung in the warm air of the cabin. Elias felt his stomach tighten. "There's more of you?" he asked carefully. The girl nodded faintly. "A lot." "How many?" She shrugged weakly. "I don't know. Maybe 10. Maybe more." Elias sat back slowly. Children, 10 of them, working somewhere they didn't belong, or worse. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl hesitated. "Clara." "That's a fine name," Elias said softly. "I'm Elias." She studied him cautiously. "You a sheriff?" He gave a faint shake of his head. "No." "A soldier?" "Nope." "What are you then?" He thought about it for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Just a rancher who doesn't like storms bringing children to his porch." That earned the smallest flicker of a smile. It vanished quickly. "They'll come," Clara whispered again. Elias leaned forward. "Why do you think that?" "Because they always do." Her voice had that distant sound again. The sound of someone remembering something too many times. "They watch us," she continued quietly. "All the time." Elias let the silence sit for a moment. "Where did you come from tonight?" he asked. Clara looked toward the window, even though it was dark outside. "The ranch." "What ranch?" She shook her head. "I don't know its name. Can you tell me where it is?" "There's a big barn," she said slowly, "and a red windmill." Elias frowned slightly. "There's a lot of windmills in this country." "There's a river," she added. "Not big, but fast." His mind began turning. There were only 2 creeks near enough that a child might reach his cabin through snow. One ran north. The other curved east toward the foothills. "How did you get away?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated. "They locked the barn," she said, "but one of the boards was loose." Her voice trembled. "I waited until they started drinking." Elias didn't need explanation for that. He had known enough ranch hands in his life. "Then I ran. In the storm?" She nodded. "I didn't know where to go." Her small hands trembled again. "I just ran." Elias looked down at the floor. 6 years old, running alone through a blizzard. He had known grown men who wouldn't have survived that. "You did real brave," he said quietly. She didn't respond. Her gaze stayed fixed on the door again. "Clara," Elias said gently, "you're safe here tonight." "But the other kids aren't," she whispered. The words landed heavy in the room. Elias leaned back slowly in his chair. He hadn't expected that. Most children who escaped something terrible thought only of their own safety. But Clara's mind was still with the others. "They cry at night," she said quietly. "The little ones mostly." Her voice cracked. "They hit Tommy yesterday." Elias felt anger begin to stir in his chest. "What for?" He fell asleep. The fire snapped loudly in the stove. For a long moment, Elias didn't speak. He had spent years trying to stay clear of other people's troubles. After losing his family, he had learned that the world was full of pain he couldn't fix, so he stopped trying. But now there was a frightened child sitting in his bed, and somewhere out in the snow, more children were still trapped. Elias stood slowly. Clara's eyes widened. "You leaving?" she asked quickly. "No," he said. He walked to the window and looked out across the snowy field. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart. Moonlight touched the frozen ground. Tracks would show clearly by morning. Elias rubbed his chin. "How long do you think it took you to run here?" he asked. Clara thought for a moment. "A long time." "Hours?" She nodded. That meant the ranch could be anywhere within 10 miles, maybe less. Elias turned back toward the girl. "Clara, did the men have horses?" "Yes." "How many?" "3, maybe 4. "And guns?" She nodded again. "Big ones, rifles." Elias walked slowly to the door. He slid the bolt open and stepped onto the porch. The night had grown quiet. Snow covered everything. No tracks yet, but that didn't mean there wouldn't be. Men who lost valuable property tended to come looking, and if Clara had escaped tonight, they might already be searching. Elias stepped back inside and shut the door. Clara was watching him carefully. "What are you doing?" she asked. He walked over and pulled his old rifle down from the wall. The familiar weight settled into his hands. "Making sure no one bothers us tonight," he said. Clara studied the rifle. Then she looked back at him. "You gonna send me back?" she asked quietly. The question stopped him. Elias met her eyes. "No," he said firmly. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, but the fear hadn't fully left her face. "Sleep now," Elias told her gently. "You're worn out." She lay back slowly beneath the blanket, but before closing her eyes, she whispered something that made Elias's stomach tighten again. "They ride out when someone runs." Elias looked down at her. "What do you mean?" Her voice was barely a breath. "They hunt." Silence filled the cabin. Outside, somewhere far across the snowy prairie, a faint sound drifted through the night. The distant echo of horses. The sound of horses faded almost as quickly as it had appeared. Elias Mercer stood still inside the cabin listening. His ears had learned patience over decades on the frontier. A careless man reacted too quickly. A careful man waited. The night returned to silence. Still, Elias did not relax. He stepped quietly to the window again, pushing aside the edge of the curtain just enough to see the snowy pasture stretching toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean the riders weren't out there. Men hunting something rarely rode straight to the door. They circled, watched, tracked. Behind him, Clara's breathing had slowed again. She had drifted back into sleep, exhaustion claiming her once more. Elias looked over at the little girl lying in his bed. Her small hand still clutched the blanket as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. He felt something heavy settle inside his chest. The frontier had always been a rough place. Men fought over land, over cattle, over pride, but children weren't supposed to be part of that world. Yet Clara had said something that would not leave his mind. They hurt us. Not just her. Us. Elias stepped quietly to the table and lit a second lantern. Then he reached for the old map rolled beneath a stack of papers. He spread it out across the table. The lines were faded from years of folding and unfolding, but the creeks and ranch trails were still clear enough. He traced a finger along Dry Creek, then outward. If Clara had run for hours through a storm, she might have covered 4 miles. Maybe 6 if fear had pushed her hard enough. That meant the ranch she came from had to lie somewhere inside that circle. He studied the map carefully. There were only 3 places that fit. 2 were known cattle outfits. Decent men ran those. The third, Elias's finger stopped on a faded mark. Grady Ranch. He hadn't heard much about the place in recent years, mostly because the Grady brothers kept to themselves. Too much, some folks said. The property sat near the bend of Blackwater Creek, a narrow valley hidden behind a low ridge. Elias leaned back slowly. A hidden ranch, away from the main road, away from town. It would be a perfect place for men who didn't want visitors. The fire snapped again behind him. Clara stirred in the bed. Her eyes opened halfway. "Mr. Elias?" she whispered. "I'm here," he said quietly. She looked around the cabin slowly. Then her eyes drifted toward the window. "They coming?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said. But the truth was, he wasn't sure. Clara pushed herself up slightly on the bed. Her small voice came again. "You ever seen a place with a red windmill?" Elias looked back at the map. The Grady Ranch had one. He remembered it from years ago when he had ridden cattle through that valley. A tall red windmill that squeaked loud enough to hear half a mile away. He looked back at Clara. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I might have." Her eyes widened slightly. "That it?" she asked. "Maybe," Elias said. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "The barn's big," she said quietly. "Bigger than your cabin." "That's so," she nodded. "And they keep us in the back part." "Us?" "The kids." Elias felt that same tightening in his chest. "How many boys?" he asked. "5," she whispered. "And girls?" "4, maybe 5. Any grown folks with you?" She shook her head. "Just the men." "3 of them?" She nodded. "Sometimes 4 when the big one comes." "The big one?" He don't stay much," she said, "but the others listen to him." Elias folded his arms slowly. 3 men, maybe 4, holding a barn full of children. His eyes drifted again to the rifle leaning against the wall, then back to the map. Years ago, Elias Mercer had been known for something: tracking. He had followed outlaws across deserts and mountains when the law needed someone quiet and patient. But that had been a long time ago. He had buried that life when his family died. He had sworn never to pick up that work again. But Clara's next words made that promise feel suddenly very small. "They hurt Tommy bad yesterday." Elias looked at her. "How bad?" Clara swallowed. He couldn't stand up after. Silence filled the cabin. Elias slowly rolled the map closed. His mind was no longer debating. The decision had already been made. He walked to the stove and added another log to the fire. Then he crouched beside the bed again. "Clara," he said gently. She looked up at him. "You did a brave thing running here." Her eyes filled again. "I left them," she whispered. "They told me to." "Who did?" "The older boy, Jacob." She wiped at her nose. "He said if I got away, maybe someone would help." Elias rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Well," he said quietly. Jacob picked the right direction. Clara studied his face carefully. "You gonna help them?" she asked. The question hung in the warm air between them. Elias thought about the quiet life he had built for himself, the peaceful years, the distance he had kept from trouble. Then he thought about 10 frightened children locked inside a barn, and men who beat them for falling asleep. He stood up slowly, walked to the rifle, checked the chamber, loaded it. Clara watched him carefully. "You going now?" she asked. Elias pulled his heavy coat from the wall. "No," he said. "Not tonight." He glanced toward the dark window. "They'll be watching for you." Clara lowered her head. "But tomorrow," Elias slung the rifle over his shoulder. "Tomorrow we find that ranch." A flicker of hope crossed Clara's face for the first time, but before she could say anything more, a sudden sound shattered the quiet. Hooves, much closer this time, right outside the cabin. Elias's hand moved instantly to the rifle. A man's voice echoed through the snowy night. "Anyone home in there?" Elias's eyes hardened. Clara's face turned pale. And then the man outside called again. "We're looking for a little girl." The cabin went completely still. Elias Mercer didn't move. Outside, the horses shifted in the snow, their hooves crunching softly against the frozen ground. Clara's small fingers clutched the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. The man outside called again. "Anyone home?" His voice carried the rough confidence of someone used to getting answers. Elias stepped toward the door slowly, rifle in hand but held low. He glanced once at Clara. "Not a sound," he whispered. She nodded quickly, eyes wide with fear. Elias reached the door and slid the bolt aside just enough to open it a few inches. Cold air rushed into the cabin. 3 riders waited in the moonlit yard. Their horses breathed clouds into the night air. The man in front leaned forward in his saddle. He wore a heavy coat and a dark beard that looked stiff with frost. "Evening," he said. Elias rested his arm casually against the doorframe. "Evening." "We're looking for a girl," the rider said. "Little thing, blonde hair." Elias frowned slightly as if thinking. "Girl? Ran off from our ranch this afternoon," the man continued. "Storm must have scared her. We're just trying to bring her home." Behind him, the other 2 riders watched silently. Elias studied their faces. Hard men. Not ranch hands worried about a lost child. Hunters. "Can't say I've seen anyone," Elias said calmly. The bearded man leaned a little closer in the saddle. "You sure about that?" Elias shrugged. "Been snowing all night. Haven't stepped outside much." The man's eyes drifted past Elias toward the warm glow inside the cabin. "You mind if we take a look?" Elias's hand shifted slightly on the rifle. "I do, actually." Silence stretched between them. The wind rustled through the trees behind the cabin. One of the riders behind the bearded man spat into the snow. "You hiding something, old man?" he muttered. Elias's voice remained steady. "Just tired of strangers knocking on my door after midnight." The bearded rider studied him for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the rifle. He recognized it, not just the weapon, the way Elias held it. Men who had spent years with guns could spot another like them. "You Elias Mercer?" the man asked suddenly. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he nodded once. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Heard about you." "That's so. Used to track people for the law." "Used to." The rider chuckled softly. "Well, if you see that little girl, you send her back our way." His tone changed slightly then, less polite, more warning. "She belongs to us." Elias's eyes hardened. "Ain't how children work." The rider's smile vanished. For a moment it looked like the conversation might turn ugly. Then the man tugged his horse's reins. "We'll find her," he said. The riders turned and began moving back toward the trail. But before disappearing into the darkness, the bearded man called back over his shoulder, "She won't survive the cold out here alone." The sound of hooves faded slowly into the night. Elias stood on the porch long after they were gone, watching, listening, making sure they didn't circle back. Finally, he stepped inside and shut the door. Clara sat upright in the bed now, trembling. "They were here," she whispered. Elias nodded. "You know them?" "The tall one," she said softly. "He's one of them." Elias removed his coat slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "now we know for certain." Clara looked confused. "Know what?" "That you came from the right place." She hugged the blanket closer. "You still going tomorrow?" Elias looked at the rifle leaning against the table. "Yeah," he said. "I am. But they'll be watching." Probably. Then how you gonna get there? Elias smiled faintly. There's more than one trail in this country. Not. Morning came gray and bitter cold. The storm had cleared, leaving the prairie buried beneath deep snow that glittered under the rising sun. Elias saddled his horse in the small barn behind the cabin. Clara stood in the doorway watching him. You ever ride? He asked. She shook her head. Well, he said, tightening the saddle strap, today you learn. Her eyes widened slightly. You taking me? Can't leave you here, he said. They'll come back. Clara hesitated. But the other kids... Elias looked toward the distant hills. That's where we're headed. By midday, they reached the ridge overlooking Blackwater Creek. Elias pulled his horse to a stop. Below them lay a narrow valley surrounded by low hills, and there, standing near a weathered barn, a tall red windmill turned slowly in the winter wind. Clara gasped quietly. That's it. Elias studied the ranch carefully. Smoke drifted from a chimney. 3 horses stood tied near a corral. He could see 2 men moving between the barn and the house, but what caught his attention most was the small set of footprints leading to the back of the barn. Too many for ranch hands. Children. Elias slid down from his saddle. We wait until dark, he said. Clara nodded. They settled behind the ridge as the sun slowly sank across the snowy valley. Hours passed. Finally, night wrapped the ranch in shadow. Lantern light flickered faintly from the house. Elias checked the rifle again. Then he looked down at Clara. You stay right here, he said. But I'll bring them out. Her small voice trembled. You promise? Elias knelt in front of her. I promise. Then he stood and began walking down the dark slope toward the barn. The windmill creaked slowly above him. The barn door loomed ahead, and inside, faint voices drifted through the wooden walls. Children. Elias gripped the rifle tighter. Tonight. Those kids were going home. But as he reached the barn door, a lantern suddenly flared to life behind him, and a voice growled through the darkness. I had a feeling you'd come, Mercer. Elias Mercer stopped walking. Slowly he turned. A lantern glowed behind him, its yellow light cutting through the cold darkness. Standing beside the corral fence was the tall, bearded rider from the night before. The man held the lantern high in one hand. In the other rested a rifle. 2 more men stepped out from the shadows of the ranch house. They had been waiting. I had a feeling you'd come, Mercer, the bearded man said with a crooked smile. Elias didn't raise his rifle yet. Then you should have packed up and left while you had the chance, Elias replied quietly. The man chuckled. You're a long way from your porch. So are those kids. For a moment the wind was the only sound. The windmill above the barn creaked slowly as it turned. The bearded man's smile faded. You always did stick your nose where it don't belong. Children being beaten tends to do that. The man's eyes hardened. They're workers. They're kids. One of the other men spat into the dirt. You ain't walking away from this, old man. Elias finally lifted the rifle. The movement was calm, controlled, the kind of motion that comes from years of practice. You'd be surprised what I walk away from, he said. The standoff hung in the freezing air. 3 men, 1 cowboy. But the men had made one mistake. They believed Elias Mercer had come to bargain. They were wrong. The bearded man suddenly raised his rifle. The shot cracked across the valley. Elias had already moved. His rifle fired almost at the same instant. The lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed the yard. Shouts erupted. Another shot exploded from the house. Wood splintered off the barn door beside Elias. He rolled behind a stack of barrels near the wall. A second shot from Elias's rifle dropped one of the men near the porch. The remaining rider cursed loudly. You should have stayed home, Mercer. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly along the shadow of the barn. The man near the fence fired blindly into the darkness. The bullet struck the dirt several yards away. Elias stepped out just long enough. 1 clean shot. The man collapsed into the snow. Silence returned. Silence. For a moment, the ranch yard was still again. Only the windmill creaked above the barn. Then a door slammed inside the house. The bearded man was running. Elias moved quickly across the yard. The house door burst open. The man stumbled outside and raised his pistol, but Elias was faster. His rifle fired once more. The man dropped heavily onto the frozen ground. The valley went quiet, completely quiet. Elias lowered the rifle slowly. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. For a long moment he simply stood there, listening. Nothing moved. Then, a small voice drifted from inside the barn. "Mister?" Elias turned quickly. He pushed open the barn door. Inside, the smell of hay and cold wood filled the air. Lantern light flickered weakly from a hook on the wall. And there they were, children. 9 of them, huddled together near the back stall, thin, dirty, eyes wide with fear. One older boy stepped forward carefully. "Are you the man Clara went to find?" he asked. Elias nodded. "You Jacob?" The boy's eyes widened. "She made it? She's safe." Relief washed across the boy's face. Elias looked around at the others. "You all ready to leave this place?" For a moment the children didn't move. Then one of the smaller boys began to cry. Soon the others followed. Not from fear, from relief. Elias lowered the rifle. "All right," he said gently. "Let's get you home." By dawn the valley looked different. The ranch was quiet. The men who had ruled it were gone, and a long line of small footprints led up the ridge where Clara waited. When Elias appeared with the children behind him, Clara jumped to her feet. "Jacob!" The older boy ran the last few steps. Clara threw her arms around him. For a moment neither of them said a word. They simply held on. Elias watched quietly. Something warm stirred in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. 2 days later, the small town of Dry Creek buzzed with the news. Sheriff Rourke had little choice but to arrest the last surviving ranch hand who had been hiding in town. Once the truth came out, the people of Dry Creek were furious. The Grady Ranch was shut down for good. The children were taken to the town church while officials searched for their families. Word spread quickly across the frontier. And one afternoon, a man rode into town who had been searching for months. Jonas Whitfield, Clara's uncle. The reunion happened outside the church. Clara ran straight into his arms. He lifted her off the ground, holding her tightly as tears ran down his weathered face. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. Clara shook her head. "I found someone." She pointed across the street. Elias Mercer stood beside his horse, adjusting the saddle strap. Jonas walked over slowly. "You the man who saved my niece?" Elias shrugged. "Just gave her a place to warm up." Jonas extended his hand. Elias shook it. "Thank you," Jonas said quietly. Clara stepped closer. "You leaving?" she asked Elias. "Got cattle that won't feed themselves," he said with a faint smile. She looked down for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket. From it, she pulled a small red ribbon. It was worn and faded, but she handed it to him carefully. "So you don't forget me." Elias took it gently. "Don't think that'll be a problem." Clara hugged him quickly, then ran back to her uncle. Elias watched as they rode away down the snowy road. The town slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. But Elias Mercer didn't feel quite as alone as he once had. Back at his cabin that evening, the fire crackled softly once again. Elias sat beside it. The small red ribbon rested in his hand. Outside, snow began falling once more across the prairie. But this time, the silence didn't feel so heavy, because somewhere out there, a little girl was safe.